G'day folks, and welcome to this session report for Stalingrad 42. This is going to be a report of my recent gameplay via Vassal. For those of you who are not familiar with the game, this is published by GMT Games. It is a Mark Simonitch design in his Zockbond 19XX style of games, featuring the likes of Ardennes 44, Holland 44, Normandy 44, and many others. In my mind, this is one of his best. It sits right behind Ardennes 44 as my second favourite in the series. It is currently, the second edition is currently on GMT's P500 site. Now, hopefully this report will give you a sense of how this plays out. It is certainly his biggest title. If I can zoom out here, you can see how vast this map is. It has a massive footprint, the biggest footprint of any of Mark's Zockbond series style of games, but in my view, it's that vast, sprawling landscape which is one of its greatest appeals. Okay, so in this particular gameplay, it's a two-player game, but I play this two-handed in effect. So I'm solo and I play both sides, and it works really well because it's fully open information. The Germans started off quite poorly in the north. This is where they have one of their main sort of offensives, Second Army, 4th Panzer Army in particular, trying to break through these Soviet fortified belts. There are sort of two main belts, one in the north, another one in the south, and then a small defensive line around Rostov. In the north, the Axis offensive did not start well. They had a few early bad rolls, and the Soviets were able to pull back away slowly. The Germans, okay, so the Germans have a benchmark each turn, and this is kind of a guide to how many victory points they should have, and they get victory points from capturing these objective locations. If they can ever get 6 points ahead of that benchmark, they automatically win the game. If they ever fall 6 points behind that benchmark, they automatically lose the game. So the Germans really have the impetus here to go out, drive, capture these objectives, stay ahead of that benchmark. The Soviets are trying to do the opposite. They're trying to slow down the Germans, stop them getting those victory points, try and put them behind that benchmark. The Soviets are almost always on the defensive. They will have opportunities here and there for small counterattacks, but usually they're only very small counterattacks, and they're just trying to slow them down for the most part, but until at least a very, very late stage of the game. And to do that, they need to preserve their forces, because this is, as you may have just seen from the turn record track, it's a long game. It goes for 36 turns. It's a long time for the Soviets to have to defend. They need to preserve as many of their forces in these early turns as possible. And the Germans are trying to destroy them. So in this game, the Soviets are able to pull back quite well. They lose heavily, it's inevitable, but they, I think early they weren't losing as much as anticipated, and things were looking really good for the Soviets early on. Up until turn 4-5, the Germans had not really made much ground and didn't really have a great breakthrough. It was only really around the sort of turn 5, turn 6 that we start to see a decent breakthrough, and the Soviets are really having to pull back in strength. So this is their initial situation. You've got the 4th Panzer Army in the north, you've got the 6th Army in the south, in the centre here, 1st Panzer Army in the south. Not much progress was made in the southern area. The Germans just, Axis forces broadly, just kind of held their ground for the time being. They don't have a lot of strength, didn't want to exhaust their efforts grinding through this fortified belt. They were waiting for this northern advance to come down. So let me show you the situation at the end of turn 5, in effect, I think this is. So this is a situation up in the north, and you can see way up in the north, it was not, I mean, the Soviet defences are still sort of 3 hexes away from Voronezh, so the Germans struggled to get across the Don River here. The Germans face their first major decision here. They can either dedicate the forces to try and cross the Don early and capture Voronezh, which is worth 2 victory points, or they can just shift to the south. And because of their failures in the north, I decided early on to shift my offensive to the south, almost a historical sort of drive along the Don River to the south. So that's what's happening here. Their main breakthrough, perhaps the most important early German breakthrough, came in the centre here with the 6th Army. They managed to break through those those initial Soviet defences, push out a little bit, and as the Soviets were pulling back, the forces in the north were able to come down. The 4th Panzer Army were able to come down and link and really help make that sort of small breakthrough a much larger bubble. And so you can see here the Soviets were now, by this stage, by the end of turn 5, 6, really having to pull back their forces. And again, even by this stage, they're doing so very well. They're pulling back, they're slowing down the Germans. For the Soviets, it's a balancing act. Pulling back, giving up ground, not too much ground, whilst slowing down the Germans, not giving up these VPs, these victory point objectives, without losing too many of their forces. And it's always difficult to know exactly how much ground to give, exactly how much of a strong stand to make, or do you just rush back to Stalingrad? It's a balancing act. And by this point, I think it's fair to say that things are looking really good for the Soviets. This was the last sort of good view of the Soviet positions, because just a couple of turns later, the Germans, who were focusing all their armoured divisions on that drive, and they were driving around this area, kind of hugging the Don, pushing east, and the Soviets were pulling back, starting to put their reinforcements behind the Don, build these fortifications. Suddenly, the Germans switched to the south, pushed all their armoured divisions in the sort of central south area here, and cut off this large block of over a dozen Soviet infantry divisions. Now, the Soviet infantry divisions, they're not particularly strong, but they're needed for defence. And all of a sudden, they find themselves trapped and surrounded. And even the German infantry were kind of, by this stage, able to surround and help with this pocketing of Soviet infantry divisions. So this is the first big piece of bad news for the Soviets. They were so optimistic, things are going so well. Suddenly, there's switch to the south, and they find themselves surrounded, and eventually, it takes a lot of turns. It does soak up a lot of Italian, Romanian and German infantry divisions to surround them and slowly grind down this pocket. But it did result in the loss of a lot of Soviet divisions with very few Axis losses. From here, another interesting development took place. So having surrounded and pocketed and secured that pocket, they were very careful to make sure the Soviets can't break out. They then shifted east again. They start driving east towards Stalingrad and the Don River. So again, the Soviets pull back, and by this stage they pull back most of their forces behind the Don in the east. And the Germans make another switch. So you can see here how the Soviets were pulling right back behind the Don. Suddenly, the Germans who were around this area switch again to the south. So they go east, south, drive east again, and then suddenly again switch south, where they saw an opportunity for a bridge crossing across the Don. There were Soviet defences here. They managed to wipe them out and poised themselves. In fact, they hoped for a Don crossing this turn, but they didn't get the advance they needed. So they poised just north of the Don River, ready to exploit it on the following turn. By this stage also, Rostov had fallen in the south, and this was a really slow, grinding siege. It wasn't necessarily a rush. It's good to finally capture it for the Axis forces, but it finally fell through a very long city battle on this around about this turn. So with these panzer divisions and mechanized divisions poised for a strike in the south, the Soviets tried to rail some units in to help defend, but they were smashed in the ensuing German crossing of the Don. And they just broke through these Soviet defences and had a clear opening to Grozny in the south and the oil fields. And I think it's fair to say this was probably the peak of German operational strategic planning. They had broken through, and it's right at this point that mistakes start to be made by the Germans. Right here, right now, there is no Soviet front line. They've got some defences that are pulling back. It's not really a front line. They're just pulling back, trying to save themselves. You've got some scattered defences around Stalingrad. And right now, the Germans have a range of options open to them. They can shift all these forces to the north, and they could quite easily drive and capture Stalingrad. Stalingrad's worth about 5 victory points. And that might have put them close to 6 VPs above the benchmark, possibly. It would have been a close thing though, and they may have had to capture some other victory points elsewhere. In the south though, around the Caucasus region, there are a total of 18 victory points here. So many more victory points to be had down here compared to Stalingrad. And at this point, the Axis forces, I felt that as the Axis forces, they would have more success. They would be able to capture more VPs down the south. I wasn't sure if I could capture Stalingrad quickly enough to go above that 6 VPs above the benchmark. So we decided to go down south. So we did divert some forces up here to the north, not a lot, some infantry, the Romanian cavalry, which can move quite fast, but most of the armoured mechanised panzer divisions were driven down here. And it's where things start to go wrong. In particular, so what they focus on, the decision they made was to rush their mobile forces through this gap in the Soviet line and to try and pocket another dozen Soviet infantry divisions. If they could have done that quickly, the Soviets would have had very few defences in the Caucasus. Unfortunately, the Soviets in this pocket, whilst they were kind of trapped in that pocket along the coast, as you can see here, they were still able to draw port supply, which means they still get their full movement and their full attack. And what happened, as you can see just captured here, is the Soviets were able to break out of that German Axis encirclement. And about half of those divisions were able, finally, probably more, were actually able to escape that pocket. What it eventually did was delay the Germans by so much that nothing else was happening. The Germans were so focused on trying to reduce this pocket and manage their forces coming south and contain the Soviets in that pocket that they weren't doing anything else. They weren't capturing Krasnodar. They weren't capturing any of these other VP locations in this area. So eventually, they did manage to, I don't have a photo of it, but they did manage to, a lot of these Soviets escaped. The Italians back here pushed through the area and they managed to clear this area. By that stage though, they were now falling behind by about turn 2021, around mid to late September, they start to fall behind their benchmark. And it's around about this time that that benchmark starts to rise quite rapidly. It goes from early September, it is on 11 VPs as a benchmark. By the end of September, it's up to 18. So it almost doubles over the space of, 4 or 5 turns, reflecting their need to capture these VPs in the Caucasus. Another thing happened, and that is because a lot of these locations down here are cities, the Germans decided not to waste a lot of their elite armoured steps by attacking these cities. So they brought a lot of these elite armoured steps out to the east. And let me show you the situation at the end of the game. So here we have, this is a situation up to the north, I'll come back to that in a moment, but here we have the situation. So they decided to leave Krasnodar and sort of the western Caucasus to a lot of their infantry, and they tried to shift all their armour, most of their armour out here, where they hoped to be able to effect a drive around Grozny and these VPs. If I can show you the map, there are a lot of VPs to be had out in this area. You can see, you can't actually see Grozny, but it's down in the south east, off map to the right down here. But there are a lot of VPs down here. Unfortunately, all this in effect stuffing around with their armour division costs them time and time and time. All this while, they weren't gaining victory points. They eventually cleared out Armavir, but by the end of the game, they hadn't captured Krasnodar and had been sitting kind of right in front of them for a month. They hadn't captured Voroshilovsk, and again, this was a location easily within reach for many, many turns. It's not far from Rostov. They had just squandered these opportunities by deciding not to attack the cities, by trying to move all these units here, for example. They went on their long march around through here. They attacked Soviet forces out here. They advanced down here to Vody, And then they pulled back when they realised the situation was getting desperate and they needed to start capturing VPs. And they captured one, and that was it. So in this final turn, we got to turn 21, I think maybe, yeah, I think 21. The Axis forces needed, the benchmark was 18, and they only had 12. So they were 6 or more points below that benchmark. They had gone from a really commanding position here, and even here, I'd say, a commanding position here where there are several victory points above their benchmark, to squandering those opportunities. And it was a really disappointing end because looking back, there were so many opportunities for the Axis forces to make something of this incredible situation. They could have probably just attacked these Soviet positions and wiped them out. Instead, they tried to do it the easy way. Well, it would have been easy to attack them. They tried to do it the more passive way. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I had just had this recent success of pocketing these units. You can see the last remnants of those units up in the north, and I was thinking, yeah, I could replicate that in the south, and it was the undoing, I think. Their attempt to pocket these units against the coast where they can get port supply, where they fought their way out and got that breakthrough, was the undoing of Axis forces. In the end, the drive towards Stalingrad really stalled. The Soviets built a lot of fortifications. All of these hexes are fortified. You can't quite see them. I put the fortified icons at the bottom of the stack for the most part. So this is fortified, 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 and the Soviets, the Axis forces, looking at this line of fortifications, just decided not to do anything with it, just to pull back and effectively stare at it. Up in the north, it's the Germans were trying to capture Voronezh. Again, they didn't have a lot of armor in this area. There is one, here we go, one Panzer division, one elite Panzer division. They came very, very close. You can see it's surrounded on 3 sides, and the Soviets are struggling with numbers in this area. They're struggling to get numbers into Voronezh, so it's grinding down. They just needed some more time. And this is where it's frustrating, because the VPs, so that the Germans were 1 VP off continuing the campaign. And I think Voronezh, it's worth 2 victory points, it's probably 1 or 2 turns away from falling. And then Uzman is probably another turn or 2 away. And down the south, they're attacking Krasnodar, that's 1. They're close to Maikop, that's 2. They're about to capture Voroshilovsk, that's another 1. And then down here, there are so few Soviet defences. So I felt like if the Germans just would have pushed a little harder and not stuffed around, victory was, I think, within their grasp. It is certainly a victory squandered down here in the Caucasus. And looking back, I am thoroughly disappointed at how I played as the Axis forces. Again, to contrast, to go from this situation and on the cusp of what looked to be right now as an easy victory, a dominant victory, and Soviet forces almost being wiped out in the Caucasus, to this and just sitting and staring at these Soviet cities. So the net result, again, was a Soviet victory, a Soviet automatic victory on turn 21, the first mud turn. So on this turn, German movement rates increase. It becomes even more difficult. And they struggled even just to attack those cities, to get the forces moving around. But look, it is such a fascinating game, folks. If you have an opportunity to play Stalingrad 42, I would highly recommend it. If you're a fan of Mark Simonitch's Zockbond 1940X style of games, this is one of the best. It is big. It's almost a monster, but yeah, really fascinating. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching, and take care.